Дуже дякуємо, Тетяна. Цікава і корисна інформація. І ми будемо продовжувати далі. Так? Тетяна, дякуємо. Дуже корисно і цікаво. І далі в нас наступний спікер. І в нас сьогодні на події не лише українські, а й іноземні з нами учасники. І зараз ми подивимося відеозапис виступу від Манав Сачдєва з МКН Київ. Він член наглядової ради ВРК у напрямку амбасадорства в Diplomatic and Donor Organizations. І саме з цим пов'язана буде і доповідь. А саме це буде відео на тему Vision and Framework for Partnerships with Development and Diplomatic Organizations. So let's watch.
Hello and greetings to all of you from New York City. I'm actually in New York sending this speech to you and message to you. The topic I'm asked to speak, so as you know, I'm Manav Sachdeva. I represent your coalition as your ambassador to the diplomatic and development organizations. I am going to speak to you on various aspects of that, how to engage diplomatic and donor organizations, how to understand the contracting space, and how to also understand the space around what it means to look at the structure of the organizations, what is the language for these organizations and how to speak to them, what is the contracting for them, how to network or party with them, and finally, how to find your niche or your specific space with them. Plus a bit bonus to understand that what do you gain other than money, or what do you gain by working with such organizations. So let's start from the beginning. I will start by first talking to you about the structure. So the structure of these organizations, just so you understand, is that there are several different kinds of international organizations. And to understand their classifications, you have to understand that some of them are what we call multilateral. Multilateral means many-sided. So multilateral organizations are organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and organizations that have complex sides to them, complex memberships to them, like the OSCE, the UN, the World Bank, etc. Now, these organizations have a sort of incentive to work with contracts with organizations and companies like yours. They typically don't start off with a big contract. They start with a smaller one, $20,000 to $30,000. They then grow once they have confidence in you and you are able to deliver. They grow by giving, potentially in the long term, an LTA or a long-term agreement by which you are able to both win the trust and also potentially get beyond early stages of the bidding process. So just keep in mind that the first space is something called the multilaterals, or the UN / OSCE / World Bank, that space. Then you have something called the bilaterals. Bilaterals are two sides. So bilateral organizations are typically your embassies, your USAID, your direct impact organizations, as well as the diplomatic or donor representations. So that would or could be even directly EU delegations, could be US Embassy, Canadian Embassy, could be any number of their aid agencies as well. So for example, UK has DFID or UKAID, which means United Kingdom's Agency for International Development. United States has USAID or United States Agency for International Development, and as such they all have direct contracts or direct work with people. Now they are faster in some ways. They also have ability to give you more funds, but there's a two-step process. One would be where you get bids and tenders with them. The other is to actually directly engage with heads of agencies or donors that are bilaterals, i.e. the embassies or their aid agencies, and try and win contracts with them through an engagement on campaigns and such. Sometimes, like for example for the US, they also go through something called contractors or subcontractors. This would be your DAI, Chemonics, and other sort of people that take contracts from the bilaterals and then work with the country that they're based in. So in Ukraine, you would also be able to then become subcontractors or secondary companies working with people like Chemonics or DAI if you cannot directly work with USAID or embassies. So that's another important consideration. These are called your bilaterals. Then you have something called IFIs. IFIs are international financial institutions. So this is your, International Monetary Fund, all your interdevelopment banks, ADB, Asian Development Bank, banks that are set up to work to give loans or work on reform processes with the government of the host country. Now that's where you come in to offer services through helping do the reform process in that space. So that's your IFIs. IFIs tend to have bigger spaces or bigger contracts, but you have to then be ready to absorb and deliver. But it's a complex compliance process, so just be ready that there might be, what it means by compliance process, there might be a lot of forms to fill, a lot of rules to follow in IFIs. So just keep that structure in mind. Then the next step is something called the iNGOs, which are international non-governmental bodies or international non-governmental organizations. These are your big like Red Cross or Save the Children or International Crisis Group, all your big NGOs that have huge budgets, and they are able to also work with companies like you, and you may be able to get contracts directly with them. And that's really helpful because many people don't even know that they exist in the private sector and don't understand that their budgets are sizable enough that they can partner with you. Just keep that in mind. Then you also, as I've already told you about, are the contractors. These are all private companies, but in the development sector, like Chemonics and DAI. So this is just the overall structure of the organizations that you could work with. Then the second bit is understanding the language. It's very critical. You need to understand that there's a lingo or a language that must be followed. The language of development, a language of partnership with this sector is as critical as the deliverables. So sometimes they will ask questions like impact, or they'll ask questions like what good will it do for the beneficiaries. So I think you need to know what they mean when they say a word beneficiary or impact, or what are the outputs of this work, or what would be the metrics or the way to measure that they've done impact or they've done something good. Because remember, these organizations are set up to try and show to their host governments or to their capitals back home, or to their presidents, prime ministers, that they've done good with their money and bought political capital for them, or bought goodwill for them in Ukraine. So it's your job to kind of learn and go online or otherwise and learn the way this sector talks. Just the same way that in advertising and in your businesses you have a certain way of speaking and people understand a language, so in this sector as well it's important to understand the language. So I would strongly advise that you spend some time learning the lingo, the language, the impact, the whole storytelling of metrics, how people speak in that space, because when you don't, they will lose confidence and you may lose contracts that way. Then third is, speaking of contracts, third is the contracting. Contracting modality needs to be understood. I started to allude to that a little bit earlier. Now, some contracts will be contracts for services. Some contracts will be contracts for partnerships. Some contracts will be a kind of a technical long-term agreements. Some contracts will be contracts that are specific task-oriented to test you out. Some contracts, they may try to tell you to try pro bono, a part of it, meaning you just kind of do it for goodwill. I would strongly urge you to resist doing too much pro bono and try and get paid for it, even little, to try and build up a portfolio here. Your goal is to also, you may need a year of several contracts at smaller amounts before you build a portfolio of development and donor organizations before you are able to go for bigger fish or bigger pitches. So just remember, in contracting space, try to understand clarity of contracts. What are the deliverables? What is the amount? When will you be paid? At what tranches? And what would be the benchmarks for each tranche or each part of the payment? And try to get as much clarity as possible. This sector does have some struggles in that it gets a bit wishy-washy or not clear. And so I think it's very important to be very, very clear as much as possible to get clarity on contracts and clarity on deliverables and clarity on payments. So that's really very helpful if you can work on that. And then there's next bit, which is how do you win trust, which is the party space. Now this is where it's very important to understand that just like it is in your commercial space and other sector with all your clients, it's important to understand that here you must go to diplomatic receptions, development receptions. You must find a way to, it's been a hard year with the COVID, a year and a half, but to try to find out what are the conventions or the important meetings or annual get-togethers, what are the current moments in which the embassies, some embassies run happy hours, some do something called brown bag discussions, which are discussions over a topic. Some are doing sort of fundraiser receptions. Some are doing campaigns, events. Some are doing certain ways in which they are celebrating the closure of a project or the opening of a new project, and then they like to invite Ukrainian companies or organizations to come in. It's very important to get on all major embassies and aid agencies, donor lists, invitation lists, so that you designate a few people. Ideally, you should put the CEO and a few top people as the people to be invited and the people to attend. But it should also be hopefully somebody who can speak English, somebody who can understand that world, somebody who learns about it, and somebody who's senior enough and has business cards also. Guys, get business cards, and you go to these receptions, go to these parties, and get to know the ambassadors, get to know the heads of agencies, get to know each and every let's say principal of each different department. Sometimes for example, in the US space, there are very complex modalities that are different, so that the US State Department may be issuing contracts or doing work. The US Embassy may be doing work, but don't imagine that they talk to each other. Sometimes they each have different budgets and different structures by which they are able to engage separately. It is all the US government, so to speak. Same happens in the UN as well. Same happens in large organizations. You'll notice that they each have separate ways to talk. So get as many as possible your mailing lists, and you'll find out more. Like for IFIs also, it's very important to get on the World Bank stuff, meetings, brown bags, events, to socialize and to get to know. The more you understand this sector, you also know people, you'll also hear about opportunities and contracts. So that's really, really important. Party is important. Be ready to party with the people. This is really fun, and it's really good. The wine's good, the cheese is good, also conversations are good, and they're different. And the more you're comfortable with that, the better. Then the beyond this is the important part is the niche. The niche. Now this is where I'm going to focus a bit on. Each of you have to figure out what is your specific niche here. There's a niche that we fill collectively, but each of you as a company may have a particular niche or a particular strength. Some may be very, in broad strokes, one could be very, effectiveness driven or creativity driven, or one is size driven, like you're working with small or boutique sizes. Some are driven with medium size, some are driven with very large. Also the idea of niche as in their strengths sometimes. So for example, some sectors are working on corruption or anti-corruption, some are working on education, some are working on women's rights or human rights issues, some are working on children's issues, so there is a very critical question about understanding your strengths, your niche, your persuasiveness, your products, such that your partnerships also come from a space of maybe strength, a place of perhaps the ability to convince that you have worked in this sector, you are able to. So if you worked on defense issues, you show that you've worked on military issues. If you've worked on foreign policy issues, you show that. If you've worked on specific, or if you're growing in that space. So the niche or the carving out of your space in this sector is quite critical to be able to be convincing. I understand that your sector, you walking in may be much more, let's say, experiences with commercial space, but knowing where and how you've done your niche is really helpful, because then the other also feels that you're not just there to just get any contract, that you actually represent a specific ability or specific match to whatever the client here also wants in the development space or the international donor space. The important thing now also is that how do you deliver? Now you also need to start to think, when you are getting a contract, you've set up a niche, you've made a partnership, you've gotten a contract, you have understood the structure of the organization, whether it's a multi or bilateral or a IFI or a INGO or whatnot. You've understood the language of it. Now it's time to work on it and to deliver. Now this can be confusing, because once you've gotten all the contract and everything, it's also important to just remember that in this space there's a lot of kind of back and forth, a lot of communication, because there's a lot there. You will perhaps be affected in the beginning that there's not always one voice that speaks from one organization. There's several voices. So as much as possible, also try and, when you're, let's say, carrying out a contract, to have cohesion, to have maybe one person speak, or only a set of maybe 3 people speak for your client, because this is a complex space where everyone has a comment. This is an intellectual client, so to speak, in development and donor organizations. So many times you'll have a wide variety of commentary and ideas. So I think it's safe to say that you organize yourself on your part. So, I just want to tell you in conclusion that this space, the development, diplomatic, and donor organizations, present a new and huge opportunity for you to grow. Monetarily, in a new way, with understanding the language, understanding the structure, understanding the contracting, understanding how to go about the process, the language of it, delivering the contracts. But most importantly, I think you need to see this as a way to give to Ukraine. Think of it as deeper vision. Here you're doing something that will generate goodwill for you, something that will be extraordinary, that you leave a legacy for the people of Ukraine. Through these partnerships, you also do something extraordinary, for something really giving and something charitable, something wonderful, through both gaining contracts but also giving for the people of Ukraine. So just think of this as goodwill that may also generate you contracts otherwise, but also help you feel like you've done something also to help Ukraine in this difficult hour, and join partnerships with that. This is again Ambassador Manav Sachdeva. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope you grow and find contracts and enjoy this ride. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye from New York.
So thank you, Manav Sachdeva, for such important, such interesting information about cooperation with international organizations. Дуже-дуже дякуємо Манаву. І далі продовжуємо. І продовжуємо з темою, яка дуже-дуже близько до попередньої. Це буде виступ